At 77, as the afternoon light falls on the field at Great American Ballpark, people still talk about Johnny Bench as the immortal icon of American baseball, the man who completely transformed the catcher position and set a new standard for endurance, power, and tactical intelligence. He was the heart of the Big Red Machine, the team that dominated the entire 1970s with authority and overwhelming force, the one who stopped every stolen base attempt, with an arm sharp as a blade and nerves cold as steel. Two-time NL MVP, 1970-1972, 14-time All-Star, 10 consecutive Gold Gloves, 1976 World Series MVP, and 389 home runs. Those numbers aren't just statistics, they're witnesses to an era that Johnny Bench ruled with absolute command. He was inducted into the Hall of Fame in his first year of eligibility, with a near-unanimous vote, an honor reserved for only the rarest legends. They cast a bronze statue of him, retired his number 5 high above, built a museum to capture every moment he ever stood behind home plate. In Cincinnati, the name Johnny Bench isn't just an athlete, it's part of the city's soul, an eternal symbol of the resilience and glory of a time that will never return. Yet at 77, when he sits alone in the empty stands looking down at the field that nourished his entire life, those triumphs can no longer hide the truth. His body paid a price far too steep for it all. The fingers that once caught 100-mile-per-hour fastballs now tremble slightly when holding something small, knees worn cartilage thin after tens of thousands of agonizing squats, shoulders and back that stab with pain every morning until he grips the bed frame just to stand. The surgical scar on his lung from 1972 remains, a cold line reminding him of moments he nearly lost himself just to keep playing. Long sleepless nights from aching joints, the crack of bones every time he bends to tie his shoes, afternoons when he has to pause mid-staircase, because his breath comes in gasps, all cruel legacies left by time and baseball. But Johnny Bench is not a man who collapses easily. He endures, he rises, he keeps living the way he once played, no retreat, no complaints, and always carrying the iron will of a man who has faced pain his whole life, and still walks forward with unyielding pride. If you want to keep following this legend's journey of tears and grit, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next part. And if his story touches you, leave a like, so we can dive into part 2 right now. But to understand why a man can endure that much pain and still get back up, we have to go back to where it all began. A tiny town called Binger, Oklahoma, where Johnny Bench's childhood was anything but the peaceful picture people imagine. Binger back then wasn't a serene scene of bicycles and white picket fences. It was a land of skin-scorching sun, endless cotton fields where children's hands calloused before they ever touched a toy. Johnny grew up amid the red Oklahoma dust mixed with parched earth, where every morning was a fight for survival. Little Johnny started working as soon as he could stand, picking cotton until his hands bled, hauling sacks heavier than his own body, running errands on farms where the adults were always short-tempered from exhaustion. And in those fields stood his father, Ted Bench, like a mountain, strict, quiet, eyes always carrying the disappointment of a man who once dreamed of MLB but lost it to life and family duty. Ted saw Johnny not just as a son, but as his own second chance. "You have to finish my dream for me," he told the grade school boy. To Johnny that wasn't encouragement, it was a sentence, a weight on shoulders too young to even grasp the idea of a future. People often think legends grow up surrounded by cheers, but Johnny Bench grew up under expectation, and that expectation was so heavy that the boy often felt he was living for someone else, not allowed to fail, not allowed to be weak, not allowed to say "I'm tired." By high school, Johnny was becoming the athletic star of Binger, but just when everything seemed to be opening up, fate drove a knife straight into his life, a wound that left a scar in his mind half a century later. In 1965, the school baseball team's bus crashed while going down a hill. Brakes failed. Screams. The bus lurched, then slammed into a line of trees. Glass shattered like a scream ripping through the youth of 17 and 18-year-old boys. Johnny was thrown to the floor, head smashing into metal, breath choking. When he came to, the only sound was wind whistling through the twisted wreck. His two best friends, the ones sitting right next to him, no longer had a pulse. Faces that once laughed loud in the locker room now lay still, covered in blood and dirt. and Johnny, in the smell of engine oil and hot metal, realized he was still breathing, still alive, still feeling his trembling heart in his chest. They took him to the hospital, face and clothes stained with his own blood and others. When he fully woke, the first question Johnny whispered, one no one could answer, was why not me? That 17-year-old boy carried that question through his entire life. Survivor's guilt, the haunting of the one left behind, became a shadow that followed him into old age. In the years that followed, when Johnny trained until he dry-heaved, when he caught thousands of throws that bruised his wrist purple, when he endured knee pain that would make anyone else quit, it was that old haunting that pushed him to stand. Not for titles, not for cheers, but because Johnny Bench believed from a very young age that life had given him an extra chance, one his two friends on that bus never got, and he had to live worthy of it, with every ounce of ability, every bit of endurance, every light he could bring to the field, even if inside him was only a deep endless darkness. In Binger that darkness began to close around Johnny, and it would follow him through his entire journey to becoming a legend, a journey built not just on talent, but on wounds that never heal. That accident didn't just take the youth of his two friends. It woke Johnny to a brutal truth. If he wanted to live a meaningful life, he had to leave Binger, leave the cotton fields reeking of pesticides, leave the days of labor that tore his hands, leave the haunting fear that one day he too would be buried in that narrow existence. And when the Cincinnati Reds drafted him, Johnny knew it was the only ticket out of the town that had branded him with too much fear. But the road ahead was anything but easy. Minor league, the side of baseball fans rarely see, was a completely different world. No glittering lights, no packed stands, no one shouting his name with excitement. Just dusty fields with rickety wooden bleachers, locker rooms smelling of mildew, overnight bus rides that left his back aching from hard seats, and cheap meals, mostly instant noodles or cold sandwiches. Every week, Johnny and his teammates traveled hundreds of miles just to play in front of a few dozen people. No one knew who they were, no one cared what they were fighting for. Pay so low that many nights Johnny had to calculate if he had enough for liniment. But what hurt him most wasn't the thin wallet, it was his body starting to rebel against the inhuman training intensity. He was only 18-19, ages when most young men were still dreaming, but his knees were already swelling like rocks. On cold nights, Johnny sat alone in his motel room, legs in a bucket of ice, hands trembling as he massaged his knees until they turned purple. Every time he stood, he heard cracks from his bones, as if time were gnawing away his future bit by bit. The coach of the Tampa Tarpons, a man who'd spent half his life as a catcher, watched Johnny train and said bluntly during a break, "Catchers don't live long. If you want to survive, you have to hurt more than everyone else. Not just physical pain, mental too." Those words stabbed his heart like a needle. He understood the position he chose wasn't a path to glory but a road to wounds. Johnny didn't get angry, didn't push back. He bowed his head, put on the glove, and kept catching like a man desperate to live. He trained until his hands were black and blue, joints swollen like pebbles. Every throw into the glove felt like a hammer to his wrist, but he kept going, because in his head echoed the old voice, "Why am I alive?" Some practices, after catching hundreds of pitches, Johnny looked down and saw blood seeping through the glove. He took it off, skin peeled, nails cracked, the whole hand bruised like he'd been in a fight, but he slipped it back on and continued. Because he knew to escape Binger, to escape his failed father's shadow, to escape the image of that twisted bus, he couldn't quit. The little minor league fields, with dim yellow lights and gravel-strewn dirt, became where Johnny reborn himself. There, he was no longer the kid who survived the crash, no longer the boy hauling cotton until his skin tore, no longer the son carrying his father's expectations. There, Johnny was the only one who could decide his fate with every catch, every drop of sweat hitting the ground. But the price of that resilience was countless early wounds in a career later praised, but few knew it was built on pain. On freezing Florida nights, Johnny lay on the team's old bed, hugging ice packs to his knees, staring at the ceiling and telling himself, "Tomorrow I'll get up. No matter how bad it hurts," and he did, every single day. It was in those harshest years that a legend began to form, not from glory, but from near ruthless endurance. The frozen years in the minor leagues seemed endless, but for Johnny, every drop of sweat on that hard ground was a vow he wouldn't fall. And then the unthinkable happened in 1968. At just 20 years old, Johnny Bench became NL Rookie of the Year, marking the arrival of a genius baseball had never seen. A small-town kid from poor Binger, who once rubbed swollen knees in a damp motel, now stood in a stadium of 40,000 screaming his name. The press called him a phenomenon, Cincinnati's future, the gift baseball had waited too long for. They described his throws like lightning, his game reading like he saw everything half a second slower than everyone else. At 20 he wasn't just a catcher, he was the foundation of a new era, but what fans never saw was the silence after the stadium's roar. When the press conference ended, cameras stopped flashing, reporters left, Johnny returned to a cheap one-room apartment just a few blocks from the field. The door closed behind him, and the cheers vanished as if they'd never existed. The room dark, only the old AC rattling and faint yellow hallway light seeping in. Johnny sat on the wobbly wooden chair, placed ice on his bruised knees, feeling pain crawl up his back. At 20 his body carried marks most only get at 40, and in that silence, with no one calling his name, Johnny felt an emptiness success couldn't fill. People cheered idols, but the idol sat alone with fears he couldn't voice. He feared this body, the one that betrayed him at 17 in the crash, that ached in the minors, wouldn't hold up to MLB intensity. Feared one day the crowd would see him collapse, and cheers would turn to disappointed headshakes. Feared those who believed in him, especially his father, would see him fail. And above all, the fear carried since surviving the bus crash, do I deserve to be here? Johnny Bench had Rookie of the Year, but he also had nights when knee pain wouldn't let him straighten his legs. Mornings he had to brace against the wall to stand, like an old man with arthritis, not the league's fittest 20-year-old athlete. Physical pain never left him, but loneliness carved deepest into his soul. Friends his age partied, drank beer, dated, lived normal college kid lives. And Johnny? He slept early to catch pitches tomorrow. He skipped fun because his body wouldn't allow it. He lived in a discipline no one understood, no one shared. That loneliness wasn't from being alone, it was from no one truly grasping what a catcher endures. Once a reporter asked, "Do you feel different from other players?" Johnny smiled faintly and said, "If they knew what we do behind home plate, maybe they wouldn't ask." It was an answer both self-mocking and heartbreaking. The catcher position, the one closest to the ball, carrying the heaviest load, sacrificing the most, was always the least seen. People see the home run, the strikeout, the star, but no one sees the catcher squat 150, 200 times a game, glove hand purple, knees like they're being cut, and still stand up smiling like everything's fine. And that feeling only I understand myself. No one sees the catcher's pain, no one knows what I'm paying, laid the foundation for the mental tragedy of Johnny Bench's career. He became a star, but that didn't mean he was happy. He won Rookie of the Year, but that didn't mean he stopped fearing. He broke records, but the one thing that never changed was the loneliness, clinging to him like the shadow from that 1965 bus. At 20, amid tens of thousands of cheers, Johnny Bench should have felt invincible. But inside, he only felt one thing: he was walking a road no one else could follow, and that road would take him to glory, but also into an abyss he'd have to fight alone for the rest of his life. The early 1970s hit Johnny like a storm of glory. After his Rookie of the Year season, he stepped into the decade called the Machine's Reign, the era of absolute domination by the Cincinnati Reds that America had never seen. And at the center of that machine wasn't Pete Rose, wasn't Joe Morgan, wasn't Tony Paris, but the 22-year-old with iron eyes and steel-catching hands, Johnny Bench. In 1970, he became NL MVP for the first time, an extraordinary feat for a catcher, a position long seen as sacrificial, not for shining. 2 years later, in 1972, he did what seemed impossible, won MVP again, becoming the rarest catcher in MLB history to achieve this. People called him the spine of the machine, the backbone of the Reds, the one who controlled the entire game, the one every opponent feared. On the field, Johnny Bench was invincible. Laser throws that the press called robot arm, near supernatural stolen base prevention, and offensive power that made him a real threat every time he stepped into the batter's box. In 1975 and 1976, the Big Red Machine won back-to-back World Series titles, and Johnny became the 1976 World Series MVP, etching his name forever into history. From the stands, from television, from the press, he looked like a superhero, a perfect icon, a hero, a legend, but that was only half the truth. Because the other half, no one saw. The greater the glory, the crueler the price Johnny had to pay. His right shoulder tore layer by layer from throws by over 100 different pitchers each season. His back curved gradually year by year, as if his spine were being slowly crushed by thousands of squats and pops in catcher's stance. His right hand, the one all of America called the best throwing hand in baseball, went numb like an electric shock every time he caught a hard pitch, sometimes losing feeling for minutes. In the locker room, where only the hum of the vent and the smell of dried sweat remained, Johnny Bench often sat alone after games, wrapping 3 layers of ice around his knees. 3 layers, because 1 wasn't enough, 2 barely helped. His knees swelled like broken rocks, bruised purple from constant collisions with the ground. Coaches, teammates, reporters, everyone saw only the MVP, the superstar, the legend. No one saw the young man massaging his knees like an old man. Some nights he had to sleep sitting up, because lying down made his back and chest hurt so bad he couldn't breathe. Some mornings he had to pull each toe with his hands just to tie his shoes. And some days, during games, he picked up the ball, and his hand trembled slightly, enough to scare even himself. But no one was allowed to know, because Johnny Bench was a legend, and legends aren't allowed to sigh. That was the curse he carried from the day he entered MLB. He had to smile for the cameras, stay calm in interviews, be strong for the fans, become the icon people wanted, and he had to suffer in silence. No one asked, "Johnny, does it hurt?" because they didn't want to hear the answer. They only wanted to hear the crack of the ball into his glove, the sound that made Cincinnati's greatest summers. Once Tony Paris recalled, before games Johnny couldn't let go of his knees. After games, he couldn't straighten his shoulder. But during the game, no one saw it. He made the pain disappear in a strange way. That was a gift, but also a curse. A catcher doesn't just catch balls. A catcher uses his body as a shield. Every foul tip to the mask is a concussion. Every collision with the ground is a blow to the future. Every squat and stand is one step closer to a crippled old age. And Johnny Bench knew it, but he still did it. Not for titles, not for money, but because he believed his survival after the 1965 accident was a chance he had to live worthy of. When the Cincinnati Reds became the strongest team in the world, people hailed the Big Red Machine as America's sporting wonders. But at the center of that machine, Johnny Bench felt a very private fear, one he couldn't tell anyone. If this body collapses one day, who am I? Glory lifted him to the top of the world, but that same glory slowly, painfully, mercilessly crushed him. And in the silence of the locker room, Johnny knew a catcher's road is never long, but the price always follows them to the end. But the Big Red Machine knew no mercy. When that machine rolled at full speed, no one was allowed to stop, not even the man setting the pace for the whole team. In 1972, when Cincinnati needed him more than ever, Johnny Bench began feeling something wrong deep inside his body. Not knee pain, not back stabs, not numb hands, the things he was used to. This time it was deep in his chest, a dull ache, sometimes like someone squeezing his rib cage, making his breaths shallow, each one frantic as if his lungs were being drained of air. At first, Johnny hid it. Catchers aren't allowed to be weak, legends aren't allowed to complain. The star of the Big Red Machine especially couldn't let the team feel uneasy. But the pain got worse. Some games he stood behind home plate, calling pitchers, signaling, catching hard like always, but every crouch made him clench his teeth to keep from groaning. One night after a game, he coughed non-stop in the locker room, coughing until his chest felt torn. The manager and doctor came to check. Their faces weren't as relieved as expected. They demanded he get examined immediately. Tests were rushed, and just hours later, The doctor said a sentence that darkened the room: "We have to operate now. There's a mass in the lung." Johnny Bench was 24 years old, reigning MVP, at the top of the world. But one sentence made him feel like he'd fallen into a pitch-black abyss where cheers couldn't reach. The surgery had to happen fast. To reach the mass, doctors had to cut a rib. When Johnny heard that, his heart pounded like it wanted to escape his chest. He wasn't afraid of pain. He'd lived his whole life in pain. What he feared was something else, something only a catcher could understand. Breath. Without breath, a catcher can't squat, can't call the pitcher, can't throw, can't signal, can't exist on the field. For any player, lung surgery is dangerous. But for Johnny Bench, the man who lived on every breath, every drop of oxygen, it was almost a death sentence. The surgery lasted hours. Doctors removed a benign mass, but had to alter the chest cavity. A rib was cut to access the damaged lung area. When Johnny woke up, his body hurt like someone had smashed him from the inside. Every breath was a knife, every movement a battle. He looked down at his chest, white bandages, a long incision, bruised skin, breaths weak like they might stop. And he knew he wasn't the same man anymore. A few days later, when he could speak, Johnny whispered one sentence: "I'll never be myself again." Not a complaint, not blame, just the truth. Johnny Bench returned to the field faster than anyone expected. Some doctors said he should miss the whole season. Some said his career might be over. But Johnny came back with a stabbing chest, shorter breaths, and a heart carrying a new fear he'd never had before. On paper, he still played, still took the field, still the Reds' #1 catcher, still in the highlights, but only he knew every crouch pulled the surgical scar like it was tearing open from the inside. Nights he couldn't sleep from lung pain, just breathing enough to make tears soak the pillow. He hid it all, smiled for the press, answered with a star's calm. But inside, Johnny carried something only he understood. The phrase breath, the simplest thing in life, had become the greatest fear of his life. After the surgery, his performance began to plateau, not because he got weaker, but because his body no longer allowed him to be the perfect version he once was. The stats no longer exploded. The throws no longer had absolute velocity. Endurance dropped noticeably. The big red machine kept rolling, but its spine, Johnny Bench, had cracked from the inside. And the most painful part, no one knew, no one saw, no one heard that cry. Because on the field, Johnny Bench still stood up, still caught balls, still fought like nothing had happened. As if that surgical knife had never pierced his body, as if that fear had never existed. But in his heart, 1972 remained forever a turning point, a cut into the soul, a reminder that a legend's path isn't made only of light, but also of darkness he must carry for life. The 1972 lung surgery didn't end the tragedy. It only opened a new chapter, one where every part of Johnny Bench's body began to protest what he'd forced it to do for years. The big red machine still ran at destructive speed, and Johnny remained its soul, but beneath the catcher's gear was a body cracking day by day. His knees, the place that took the pressure of hundreds of squats per game, began to wear cartilage severely. Doctors took x-rays and shook their heads. A 24-year-old shouldn't have knees like this, but Johnny just smiled, not because he was happy, but because he knew he had no right to complain. The machine could never stop for a squeaking gear. Every time he rose from catcher's stance, it felt like someone was slicing inside the joint. Every time he walked into the locker room after a game, his knees swelled so much he had to ice them for nearly an hour to reduce it. But to catch again the next day, he only needed one thing: endurance. His wrists, the place that took hundreds of pitches over 90 miles per hour per game, began to not fully straighten. Tendons thickened and hardened like steel cables. Joints rubbed together, making small sounds like cracking wood. Some days he held a pen to sign for fans, and his hand shook from prolonged numbness. But fans didn't need to know that. They just needed the autograph. And Johnny, as always, smiled. His shoulder, the place that took throws and constant collisions, became a silent betrayer. There were nights Johnny Bench couldn't sleep because shoulder pain radiated to his chest, stabbing in waves until he had to sit up, lean against the wall all night to ease it. Post-surgery breathing was already hard. Now shoulder pain made it choppy. Some nights he breathed hard enough to feel like he'd suffocate right in the hotel room. But the next morning, he still walked onto the field with a superstar's smile, because catchers don't get days off. The cruelest thing for a catcher isn't foul tips to the mask or collisions at home plate. The cruelest thing is to squat, stand hundreds of times a day, for years, until knees and spine are ground into sand. Johnny Bench's body gradually became a prison not made of walls or bars, but of the very parts that once made him a legend. He hurt walking, hurt standing, hurt sitting, hurt tying shoes, hurt even lying down to sleep. But when the game whistle blew, when the pitcher looked back to the backstop for a sign, Johnny knelt again as if nothing was wrong. Only when the game ended did he allow himself a shaky exhale, sometimes trembling so much he had to brace against the locker room wall. Teammates said there were games he hurt so bad he couldn't remove his own gear, yet just hours later, he was back on the field like nothing happened. Because that's a catcher's responsibility, he said. A light sentence, but for Johnny, it was a vow. Responsibility to hold the team together, responsibility to call the pitcher, responsibility to protect home plate, responsibility to lead the team forward, responsibility to stand in the battle without wavering. In those years the Big Red Machine dominated America, but few knew that inside that machine, one gear was slowly breaking, and that gear kept turning, kept fighting, kept pushing, because if it stopped, the whole machine could lose rhythm. Once when a reporter asked Johnny, "Are you afraid your body won't hold up?" he stared into the distance and said only, "Every body eventually falls. What matters is it falls after you've done what you had to do." That wasn't a superstar's line. That was the line of a man who'd lived with pain for more than half his life. Through talent and glory, Johnny Bench became a legend in America's eyes. But through wounds-worn cartilage knees, wrists that won't straighten, shoulders that keep him awake, he became a legend in the harshest way. Because greatness isn't built only in spotlight moments. It's built in moments no one sees. Nights he lay breathing in pain. Mornings he forced himself up though his spine wanted to collapse. Games he endured though his body had betrayed him long ago. And all for one reason: he was a catcher. But the wounds on his body weren't the only ones Johnny Bench carried for life. If the field was where he never allowed himself to fall, then off the field where there was no glove, no mask, no crowd to lift his spirit, he became a man fragile beyond expectation. And there personal tragedies began to bloom, silently, but sharper than any pitch that ever flew into his glove. His first marriage came in 1975, when Johnny wed Vicky Chesser, a former Miss America finalist. The glow of fame blending with a baseball superstar's aura seemed to create a perfect couple, but reality was never simple. Vicky said in a post-divorce interview that Johnny didn't know how to be a husband, because he only knew how to be an athlete. That harsh line hit Johnny's deepest wound. He didn't know how to live a normal life. He only knew baseball. The marriage didn't last 13 months. Johnny returned to an empty bedroom, where the double bed now had only one side used. He looked at the hand that had caught millions of throws and wondered, if I can control an entire game, why can't I control my own life? A few years later, he married Laura Kwiatkowski, a beautiful dancer working in Kentucky. This time there was love and hope. They had a son, Bobby Bench. But Johnny was still Johnny. Constant travel, packed schedules, aching body making him moody and exhausted. They drifted apart not from lack of love, but because a superstar baseball life never allowed peace. The marriage ended quietly. Laura left with Bobby, leaving Johnny once again sitting in an empty house, hand on the child seat his boy once used. He didn't cry in front of anyone, but that night, outside the window, street lights cast in, making the room feel bigger, colder, and the emptiness deeper. His third marriage came in 1997, with Elizabeth Benton, a talented and strong woman. But their marriage quickly became a mirror reflecting wounds that hadn't healed. Arguments about time, priorities, Johnny not knowing how to be home. More dragged on for months. People leave because love fades. But Johnny and Elizabeth left because he didn't know how to love like a normal person. He only knew how to love by sacrifice, the kind for teammates, for the field, for duty. But marriage needs presence, something Johnny Bench never had enough to give. When signing the third divorce papers, Johnny looked down and saw his signature tremble, not from age, not from injury, but because he understood he was losing another person in his life, not from lack of effort, but because he didn't know how to live outside the catcher role. In 2004, he married for the fourth time to Lauren Baiocchi, a woman much younger. They had two sons, Justin and Josh, and for a while, Johnny thought he'd finally touched the peaceful dream his life had always denied. He drove the kids to school, read to them, cooked breakfast on rare mornings without travel. But then, distance, age difference, and the slow exhaustion of decades wore it down. In 2017, they divorced. He returned once more to a house where children's voices echoed only on weekends. Returned to a living room full of trophies, but a bedroom that stayed empty. Returned to the familiar feeling of a man cheered by thousands on the field, but always failing inside his own home. The pain was this: every time Johnny stepped onto the diamond, tens of thousands of Americans gave him roars, praise, admiration. But every time he came home, the door closed, the noise vanished, and he was left alone, with old family photos, an old crib, old toys his kids once played with. People praised him as a symbol of strength, resilience, the American spirit that never falls. But in the darkness of the bedroom, he was just a man who couldn't hold on to his own happiness. That was the bitterest tragedy. The man who made millions of Americans proud couldn't keep a peaceful home, not because he didn't want to, not because he didn't try, but because a catcher's life, always sacrificing himself, never let him learn to love the way normal people love. Once in a rare interview about his private life, Johnny said, "Baseball gave me everything, but it also took everything from me." And in that sentence, people heard not just truth, they heard a lifetime of loneliness stretching out like the seasons he'd played through. The broken marriages forced Johnny to face a loneliness no title or applause could fill. But then, as if life hadn't tested him enough, the next tragedy came not from fractured love, but from the one thing no one escapes, death, and it struck him one by one, year by year. As if the world were slowly stripping away the last threads, tying him to youth, to roots, to the only people who knew Johnny Bench before America called him legend. His father Ted Bench died in 1991, the strict, quiet man who threw balls for Johnny to catch as a kid, who placed the MLB dream on his small shoulders, the man Johnny both loved and feared, suddenly gone. At the funeral, people spoke of Ted as hard-working, honest, strong. Johnny stood silent. He hurt, not just from losing his father, but because he hadn't proven to Ted that his son had truly made it. In 1991, had Johnny Bench entered the Hall of Fame yet? No, that year, he'd only been retired a few years. He was a superstar, but hadn't stepped into the immortality his father once dreamed of. In the final moment of goodbye, Johnny touched his father's cold hand and whispered, "I did my best, Dad." He said it not for anyone to hear, but to fill the hole in his heart, the hole of a son who spent his life chasing a nod of approval his father never spoke aloud. Then his mother, Katie Bench, died in 2003. If his father's death carried regret, his mother's carried a deeper cut into childhood. When Katie passed, Johnny told a close friend, "It's like the last thread tying me to being little just got cut." His mother was the rare person who saw Johnny not as MVP, not as an icon, not as Cincinnati's hero, but just the kid who loved running around a red dirt field in Binghamton with a glove. Losing her meant losing the only place he was allowed to be weak. Losing her meant losing the only person who called him Johnny softly, not with the hymn-like roar of tens of thousands of fans. But life didn't stop there. It kept taking the people Johnny loved, and in 2019, when he heard his brother, Ted Bench Jr., had passed, Johnny felt his own generation fading away. Ted was the big brother, who carried Johnny on his shoulders when he was small, who drove him to practice, who always stood beyond the fence during high school games. When Johnny became a superstar, Ted never asked for anything, never used the fame, just quietly proud. And then Ted was gone. No drama, no warning, leaving only Johnny, the little brother once protected, with a void no one could fill. Johnny didn't cry on camera, but family said on the flight home from the funeral, he stared out the window for hours, not saying a word, as if his brother had taken a piece of his soul with him. His younger brother, William, had died early on, a death few knew about, but one that cast a shadow over the Bench family for decades. For Johnny, it was the first pain, a pain time never dulled, it only piled on more wounds, and as family faded with the years, others close to him, teammates who built the big red machine, also began slipping into darkness, one by one. One passed away, one got sick, one couldn't make it to reunions anymore. Another walked with a walker. The mighty image of the big red machine, the engine that crushed the league, was now only in old footage and memories. The men who created a golden era with Johnny, who hugged him after every World Series win, who high-fived after every throw, were slowly stepping into eternity. Every funeral Johnny attended made him feel a decade older. Every look at the teammate list showed another name crossed off, until one day, he faced what no legend wants to face. I'm the only one left with memories that are dying. Glory once lifted him to the top, but time peeled people away from his life one by one, leaving Johnny standing in the cold expanse of the present, where only memories and old photos on a wooden shelf remained. All those losses didn't make Johnny harder, on the contrary, they made him quieter, more pensive, heavier, as if every person who left took a piece of the big red machine, and in the end all that remained was the shadow of an old catcher, back bent, hands trembling, sitting before memories no one else shared. After years standing at too many funerals, watching the people who mattered leave his life one by one, Johnny Bench entered a phase no one expected, a new beginning. Not on the field, not under fame's lights, but in a small kitchen, with two boys too young to know who their father was to America. After his fourth marriage ended, Johnny won custody of his sons, Justin and Josh. He had beaten the century's toughest pitchers, carried entire teams on his back, won MVPs through superhuman grit, but fighting for custody shook him more than any game, because he knew this wasn't something he had to do for America, or the big red machine, or titles. This was something he had to do for himself. And when the two boys moved in with him, Johnny Bench's life, the man used to applause, contracts, cold hotel nights, changed completely. No more noisy clubhouses, no reporters waiting outside, no stands thundering like storms. Instead, kids laughing in the living room, little feet pattering on the floor, the fridge door opening and closing non-stop. A normal, simple, quiet world, something he'd never had in 60 years. Johnny taught his sons how to hold a glove, how to stand behind home plate, how to catch with the whole body, not just hands. But what choked him up wasn't passing on skills, it was his own trembling hand. His right hand, once MLB's most feared weapon, now shook slightly when throwing to his kids. The wrist that caught millions of pitches, the press once marveled at, now hurt so much that 10 straight throws left it numb. Some practices, the ball slipped from his fingers because sensation was gone. Little Justin laughed and ran to get it, unaware his dad had just hidden a stab of pain like a knife. But Johnny smiled too, not a superstar's smile. The smile of a father who knew these small moments were worth more than any trophy he'd ever won. In the afternoons, he sat quietly in the stands, watching his two boys run on the little school field. They laughed, they fell, they got up. No pressure, no comparisons, no lights, no demand to become legends. Johnny Bench, who lived his whole life meeting expectations, for the first time witnessed unconditional love, love that didn't need stats or strength, love that didn't demand standing up instantly, didn't demand becoming an icon. And in the moment, the two boys stopped in the middle of the field and yelled, "Dad, watch this." Johnny felt something he'd never known. Peace, peace, the thing baseball couldn't give him over 17 years of his career. Peace, the thing 4 broken marriages never let him touch. Peace, the thing a childhood picking cotton, a youth full of injuries, and an adulthood full of applause had never let him feel. Once, in a conversation with a close friend, Johnny said slowly, "My kids give me what baseball couldn't piece." A sentence light as breath, but heavy as a lifetime of endurance. When the boys were little, every night Johnny read to them, despite a hoarse voice from years yelling signs to pitchers, despite back pain stabbing so bad he had to keep shifting. He read slowly, word by word, and Justin rested his head on his shoulder, the shoulder torn dozens of times. Josh dozed on his lap, those knees worn down so much doctors warned of severe arthritis in old age. Those wounds once symbolized sacrifice for America. Now they were where two kids leaned to sleep, and maybe in that moment, for the first time in his life, Johnny saw that those wounds meant more than wins or titles. He drove them to school. He tied their shoes with trembling hands. He cooked breakfast, even on days his wrist was too weak to twist a milk cap. He attended parent-teacher nights like any other dad. No one there knew who he was, or if they did, they didn't say. Johnny liked that. He didn't need the lights anymore, because in his two sons' eyes, he wasn't the greatest catcher in history, wasn't MVP, wasn't a legend. He was just dad, and that was the greatest title of his life. The losses from years before still lingered, the deaths of his father, his mother, his brother, the broken marriages, the long nights in empty rooms, but when the two kids hugged him every night, Johnny felt like the old cuts, the cuts time couldn't heal, were finally starting to close, not completely, not forever, but enough for him to learn to breathe easier, live softer, and see life with eyes that saw not just pain but gratitude. And in the gentle darkness of the house, when the two boys were asleep, Johnny sat alone, looking at his shaking hands, the hands once America's symbol, and whispered, "At last I've found where I belong." On weekend afternoons, taking his two sons out to play, Johnny sometimes drove past the bronze statue of himself in front of Great American Ball Park, the statue seen as Cincinnati's immortal icon, where thousands stop each year to take photos, to point out to their kids, that's the greatest catcher in history. But Johnny at 77, every time he stepped out of the car and walked toward that statue, felt a bitter truth no crowd of fans could see through. He walked slowly, very slowly, knees trembling slightly as if those bones had been ground down to nothing but willpower holding them up, back slightly bent, each vertebra making small cracking sounds when he shifted weight. His breath came in short bursts, sometimes catching on deep lung scars, the legacy of surgery over half a century ago. The bronze statue, majestic, powerful, crouched like a young catcher, back straight, wrist sharp, eyes locked in perfect focus. That statue was immortal, didn't tire, didn't hurt, didn't know time. But the real Johnny Bench, the man standing before it, had lived nearly 8 decades full of cracks in bone and flesh. Fans often didn't recognize him right away. Some glanced, then eyes widened when they realized, Johnny Bench, it's really him. They ran over, asked for photos, autographs. Johnny, as always, smiled. He always smiled. It was a habit forged from decades under stadium lights. But behind that smile, his chest breathed hard, heavy every time wind blew through, as if the 1972 lung incision still hadn't fully healed. And his back, the one that took thousands of crouch and rises, now ached numb, to the point his toes sometimes lost feeling when he stood too long. But fans never knew that. They only saw the superstar. They only saw the legend standing beside the legendary statue. Once, after taking a photo with a family, Johnny sat on a nearby bench to rest. A boy about 10 ran up and innocently asked his dad, "Dad, why does he walk so slow? The guy in the statue looks really strong." Johnny heard it, and he just gently bowed his head, ruffled the boy's hair, and said, "The guy in the statue is the youngest, strongest version of me. And me now, I'm just an old man." The words were light but rang like metal cracking inside. Another time, when a reporter asked about his statue becoming a famous landmark, Johnny answered in a very small voice, almost a whisper, "They built a statue of me, but they don't know what I paid to get it." That wasn't a complaint, it was the truth. A truth so heavy only cracked joints, sleepless nights, and pain stretching from shoulder to chest could prove it. To earn that statue, Johnny Bench traded 2 knees with cartilage nearly gone, a right hand that no longer fully straightens, a right shoulder torn so bad many nights he couldn't sleep, a back deformed by time, lung scars that made his breath choppy for life, decades living with pain he was never allowed to show anyone. And maybe the bitterest part, people love his statue more than they know the real man standing beside it. When fans left, Johnny often lingered a moment, looking at the statue in silence. He looked at the sturdy bronze legs, he looked at the perfectly straight back, he looked at the powerful hands ready to catch a 100 miles per hour pitch, and he knew that wasn't him anymore. That was the version time had taken, that was the version his body could no longer hold, that was the version baseball had created and destroyed. Some afternoons, wind from the Ohio River blew through, carrying cold into every aged fiber of Johnny's bones. He had to grip the concrete ledge nearby to stay steady. In that chill, he felt muscles stiffen, joints seethe, like his body reminding him that memories and bronze can be immortal, but people are not. And then he turned away, walking slowly toward the parking lot. The statue stayed there, still, mighty, towering against time. But he, the real Johnny Bench, left with the crack of his back, the shake of his hands, the unsteady breath, but also with a truth: the statue could never have the quiet resilience of a man who paid the highest price to become a legend. Leaving his own bronze statue, Johnny Bench returned to his quiet home in Florida, where there were no more crowds, no more glove-cracking catches, no more teammates, no more big red machine, just an old man whose body had nearly run out of youth's magic. And here, in the silence of 77, he faced the one opponent he could never beat his whole lifetime. Every morning before the sun rose high, Johnny woke not to an alarm, but to an invisible knife twisting in his back. Back pain so bad it took minutes just to swing his legs off the bed. Some days he had to use both hands to push himself up. The body that once squatted thousands of times per season, the body that carried the big red machine. Now every small movement reminded him this body no longer belonged to an athlete, but to a man who had endured too many injuries, too many sacrifices. His right hand, the one that terrified all of MLB, now lost feeling in the fingertips. Nerves damaged from decades of catching turned the tips numb. Back then, Johnny could snag a 95 miles per hour pitch without thinking. His hand reacted faster than thought. Now he held a glass of water and had to focus not to drop it. Some mornings, the glass slipped, shattered on the floor, and Johnny just stood there, staring at the shards, feeling like his own fame was breaking into pieces. Sleep for him was no longer rest, it was a battlefield. When night fell, Johnny didn't sleep straight through. Joint pain tore his sleep into tiny fragments, shoulder burning, back jerking in spasms, knees like two rocks about to shatter. Some nights he woke 3, 4, even 5 times, shifting positions to find the least painful one, but every turn made his body groan in protest. By day he tried to walk normally, talk normally, smile normally, but at night when the house was asleep, Johnny often sat in the armchair by the window, watching his reflection on the glass. And each year, that reflection bent a little more, just a little, but enough to remind him time was slowly taking what baseball had left behind. Sometimes he stood to go to the kitchen, glanced at the big mirror, and froze, because he didn't see the young catcher with a straight back, but an old man with a slight hunch, slow steps, trembling hands, eyes gone quiet. That was the moment without cheers, without noisy stands, without the crack of ball into glove, without medals, without titles, just him and time. If a power bike accident nearly killed Simon Cowell, then for Johnny Bench, life's accident didn't come in 1 second. It came over thousands of days, slow, cruel, unannounced. It didn't knock him down instantly. It wore him away piece by piece, vertebra by vertebra, knuckle by knuckle, breath by breath. Some days his hand shook so much, he couldn't sign the J. Some days he had to stop mid-stairs to breathe. Some days back pain was so bad, he didn't dare bend to tie his shoes. Some mornings he looked at his legs and remembered youth. Those legs once hit the ground with a warrior's certainty. Now they ached like 2 tired stones. That was a fight with no crowd, no referee, no teammates, no highlights, no post-game interviews, no one patting his back, no one handing a towel, just him, fighting every day against an opponent that never loses time. But what set Johnny apart, what kept him from falling, was that he wasn't fighting to hold on to glory. He'd had too much glory. He fought only to keep the small things old age loves to steal, mornings driving the kids to school, evenings watching movies with them, surprise hugs from behind, slow afternoons tossing balls in the yard. He no longer fought for baseball. He fought to live, to be with the little children, who saved his soul from loneliness. And every night, before sleep, he looked at his trembling hands and whispered, "Tomorrow I have to try harder than today," just like he used to say when he played. Just like the legendary catcher time couldn't knock down. Time could grind bones and joints, could make breath choppy and hands shake, but one thing it couldn't touch: legacy. And for Johnny Bench, legacy wasn't just in the bronze statue or dusty trophies in a display room. It lived in the children, faces looking up at him, with eyes shining just like his own in Binger long ago. Every summer, Johnny spent time at youth baseball camps, where the grass was still lush green, where children's laughter shook the air more than the crack of bat on ball. When he stepped out of the car, the crowd of kids exploded. They pushed forward, holding out gloves, balls, caps, even shoes, just hoping he'd sign. Everyone chattered, Mr. Johnny, sign for me. Can you teach me to catch like you? You're the best catcher in the world, right?" Johnny always smiled, a smile without the pain of standing before his statue, without the exhaustion of holding a shaking glass of water, a real smile, the kind only children could pull from deep in a heart cut too many times. He sat in the dirt, despite knees like hot coals. He picked up a glove, despite swollen wrists. He took a deep breath, despite a slight chest twinge. Then he began teaching each child, with strange patience. He taught them to catch with two hands, not to make them superstars, but because he knew those small hands were weak, and that way would keep them from getting hurt. He taught them stance, feet shoulder width, back slightly bent, eyes focused, weight balanced. "Don't try to prove you're strong," he said. "Be steady first." He taught them to read the pitcher, not as an enemy, but as a teammate. "A catcher has to understand the thrower more than himself," he said. "If you don't, you'll never protect them." The kids stared, as if every word was a great secret of the universe. But those lessons, technique, strategy, pro tips, weren't the most important thing Johnny Bench wanted to leave. His real lesson was in the line he repeated at the end of every session: "Never forget you're a person before you're a player." Kids often didn't fully get it, but the adults watching from the fence did. And Johnny understood it better than anyone, because his life was painful proof of the opposite. He had to be a player first, before he ever got to be a person. He carried his father's dream from age 6, survived the accident at 17, became MVP at 20, endured thousands of crouch and rises while back, shoulder, lungs were torn. For years, he didn't know what being normal meant, didn't know rest, didn't know weakness. But watching those kids laugh bright, run, fall, get up, he understood legacy wasn't titles. Legacy was people who would continue the journey better than the generation before, because they were taught by that generation's wounds. Once, the smallest boy on the team came to Johnny after practice. Eyes shining, "Mr. Johnny, one day I'll play for the Reds. Do you think I can?" Johnny bent down, placed a slightly trembling but warm hand on the boy's shoulder. "You bet, kid. But don't just dream of being a player, dream of being a good person too." The boy hugged him tight. And in that hug, Johnny felt something strange. The boy's small shoulders, though tiny, somehow lightened the weight he'd carried his whole life. None of the kids knew that when practice ended, Johnny had to sit in his car a few minutes for knee pain to ease. None knew that every bend to pick up a ball yanked his lower back like a rip. None knew he held water bottles with both hands to keep from spilling. But that wasn't what he wanted them to know. What he wanted them to carry wasn't his wounds, but light. Light of kindness. Light of perseverance. Light of a catcher who stood through every storm. Light of a man who learned the most important thing wasn't the pitch, but the heart holding the glove. When camp ended, the kids ran off with new gloves, signatures on caps, smiles bright as summer mornings. They didn't know, but each carried a piece of Johnny Bench's soul, a piece of the big red machine, a piece of the knives in his back, a piece of sleepless nights, a piece of tears he rarely let fall. And as sunlight hit the grass, Johnny watched them and understood true legacy wasn't material. It was in the small footsteps running toward a future, unaware the path they ran. He had opened with bone, with flesh, with will. That afternoon, as the sun was just a thin line of light above the Ohio River, Johnny Bench drove back to Great American Ballpark, the place that once defined his entire life. No game, no festival, no fans, just a sparse parking lot, stadium lights flickering on, wind blowing through empty seats. An ordinary evening for the world, but for Johnny, an evening his heart had to face itself. No glory, no applause, no titles to shield him. He entered through a side gate, where familiar security guards nodded with friendly smiles. "Hey, Mr. Bench," they said. "Been a while." Johnny just nodded. His breath was still short, but his eyes lit with something both painful and peaceful, an emotion only those who laid their whole life on this field could understand. When his feet touched the soft green grass, he stood still a moment, not from fatigue, not from pain, but because every step on that turf carried thousands of memories like old film reels flashing, sharp, alive, aching to the heart. He began walking slowly along the foul line, the boundary between life and death in every game, where wild pitches once rocketed toward him like thunder, where he knelt, stood, not once or twice, but millions of times in his career. Now every step was a crack in bone, but he didn't stop. Sunset poured over the field, stretching his shadow into a curve, the shadow of the man he was now, back slightly hunched, shoulders a bit slumped, steps cautious but never lacking resolve. When he reached home plate, the spot that defined his career, Johnny suddenly stopped. He brought his right hand, the one once MLB's mightiest weapon, and lightly touched the hard dirt. A tremor, a held-back pain. Then memories flooded. The days at 20, crouching for his first pitch in his debut, sweltering July nights, sweat pouring under the mask, slides crashing straight into him from desperate runners, foul tips smashing the mask, making his head spin, rocket throws from Tom Seaver, Don Gullett, and dozens of others, slamming into his glove with force enough to break a normal man's hand. Tense games where he had to force every breath because the lung surgery scar hadn't healed. Those evenings he sat alone in the locker room with 3 layers of ice wrapped around his knees. Everything came rushing back at once, like a massive wave crashing over his heart. Johnny knelt, not as deep as before, just enough for his fingertips to touch home plate. He closed his eyes. Wind brushed his face, the stadium empty of people, but in his mind the crowd still roared. The cheers of 1975, the screams of 1976, the shouts when he threw out daring base runners. He opened his eyes. Empty stands, only the faint rattle of metal seats in the wind, and there in the vast silence, his real pain appeared. Not back pain, not hand pain, not muscle or lung pain, but the pain of loss. Loss of teammates, loss of parents, loss of youth, loss of family, loss of the body baseball demanded he sacrifice, and loss of the version of himself, the one who once stood here, strong enough to seem invincible. Johnny gently wiped a tear. It fell silently, but like the heaviest rain. Then he spoke, almost whispering, to the emptiness before him. Was the price I paid too high? The question wasn't for anyone specific, not for baseball, not for the big red machine, not for the fans. He asked life, asked himself, asked all the years that took more than he ever imagined. He thought of nights in pain so bad he couldn't stand, thought of 4 broken marriages, thought of parents gone, thought of brother Ted, who was always there for every big game, now under cold earth, thought of the kids growing up while he aged faster than ever. It all became one question: was it worth it? He stood there until the sun vanished completely. The field grew dark. Stadium lights flicked on, casting white glow over the dome and empty seats. Then, with a strength no one could understand, Johnny pressed his hands to the ground, pushed himself up. His back stabbed hard enough to make him inhale sharply, but he stood straight, stood really straight, like at 20. He looked around the field, the place that took everything from him but also gave him everything, and in that quiet void, he said clearly, strongly, "I'd do it all again. That's baseball. That's me." That wasn't the words of someone reminiscing, that was the words of a warrior, who sacrificed youth, health, family, and half his soul for moments of immortality. Tears still in his eyes, but now they carried no sadness, they carried acceptance, gratitude, and pride. Johnny Bench turned his back on home plate, every step slow but steady. Stadium lights stretched long beams across the grass, draping him in a halo like the old glory no years could erase. Near the tunnel out of the field, he turned back one last time, not to look at home plate, not to look at the stands, but to look at the version of himself, the young man who fell, who rose, who played with a giant heart. Old Johnny Bench stood there, looking into his own memory, and understood that no matter the cost, the depth of pain, the cruelty of age, he had lived true to the life fate gave him. He didn't fail, he didn't lose any battle, he let no pain stop him from the duty he was born to do. He was a catcher, he was a warrior, he was Johnny Bench, and until his final breath, he would remain the man who put his whole heart into this field, where he endured, fought, became legend. When Johnny Bench walked out of the tunnel at Great American Ballpark that night wind swept over his weary shoulders, stadium light casting a faint glow behind him, as if that silhouette still belonged here, though time had changed everything. He looked back once more, then walked to the parking lot in silence. No one knew he cried, no one heard the choked question in his throat. Was the price I paid too high? No cameras, no crowd, just an old man standing between past and present, trying to gather the meaning of his whole life. When he got home that night, his youngest son had left the nightlight on. Johnny sat in the chair by the window, where he often sat on back pain nights, and began speaking, not to anyone in the room, but as if to America itself, the country that watched him grow, fight, shatter, rise, and become an icon. That monologue wasn't for press, wasn't for TV, but for those who ever believed in him, for those losing now, for those aging, for those forcing themselves up after invisible wounds. At 77, he said softly, "I'm no longer the 20-year-old catcher who made stadiums explode every time I threw out a base runner. I no longer have the iron arms of 1972. I no longer have the straight back of 1976. But maybe I understand life clearer than ever." Johnny leaned his head against the chair, trembling hand on the chronic pain in his back. We Americans grow up with one strong idea: win, win at work, win in sports, win in life. But when time takes your strength, you realize no one wins forever. No one keeps strong legs, fast hands, or a young heart forever. Old age is the game we all have to play, whether we want to or not. He smiled sadly. But old age isn't the enemy, it's just a mirror. It looks at you and asks, how did you live? How did you love? How did you get up after the hardest falls? Johnny was talking about himself, the little Binger kid forced to carry his father's dream, the boy who survived the bus crash, the young catcher bearing the invisible weight of an icon, the man divorced 4 times, the son who lost parents, the brother who lost siblings, the legend with back pain every morning, shaking hands every night, the single dad relearning love past 60. You Americans know, he continued, baseball wasn't my greatest lesson came from loss. He looked down at his trembling hands, the hands once so quick the league changed how catchers were judged. Losing teammates, losing my brother, losing parents, losing youth, losing health, losing the best versions of myself. But then I realized loss doesn't take everything. It leaves something more important: humility. He smiled lightly, voice hoarse with emotion. At 20 I thought I was immortal. At 50, I thought I had to prove to the world I still mattered. But at 77, I just want to be a good dad, a decent person, a man who lived right. He looked out the window, his reflection on the glass more bent than last year, but his eyes brighter, gentler. About family, he said slowly, maybe I failed many times. I missed chances to be a good husband to 4 women. I was gone too long, too many bus rides, too many doubleheaders, and when I came home the house was sometimes just empty. Johnny placed a hand on his chest. But when my two little boys hug me every night, I realize sometimes God doesn't rewind our past. He gives us a new chance to start over. His voice caught, and I tried my hardest, not for fame, not for the Reds, not for fans, but because I want my boys to know their dad learned the most important thing in life, how to love right. He turned to health, the thing he traded beyond money. You think I'm strong, but the nights I hurt so bad I couldn't stand, I learned the truth. Health is the greatest victory. No one teaches when you're young. He spoke of sleepless nights, trembling hands dropping glasses, evenings bracing both hands against the wall to stand straight. I want you, the American audience watching, to understand this. Success doesn't make up for lost health. Take care of your body. Treasure every breath, every step. Then he spoke of resilience. I know you carry your own wounds. Some lost loved ones, some lost jobs, some lost faith, some lost themselves. He paused long, as if to make sure everyone heard. If I, a man who survived an accident, lung surgery, dozens of injuries, 4 divorces, decades of loneliness, and aging's destruction, if I can still get up, then you can too. His voice grew stronger, not from effort, but sincerity. We're not strong because we never fall. We're strong because we rise after every fall, even when no one's watching, no one's cheering. Johnny reached for the family photo on the table, him and his 2 boys smiling under Florida's sun. This, he said, is the final victory. Not MVP, not gold gloves, not titles, but the love we leave behind. He looked into the imaginary camera before him, as if speaking to every American watching his life story. A person's true legacy isn't trophies. It's how they loved, how they endured, and how they rose when no one was watching. Johnny Bench closed his eyes. His back hurt, his breath grew heavy, but his heart was lighter than ever, because he knew that finally, after all the tragedy, all the loss, all the wounds, he had found his life's meaning. And before ending the story, he added one line for those following this journey. If my story touches you, leave a like, as a reminder we're not alone on the road to growing up. And if you want to keep hearing journeys of people who fought and lived fully, hit subscribe. Not for me, but for you, so every day, we learn together how to rise. Then he smiled, the smile of a man who fell, lost everything, but kept walking. A legend, a father, a warrior of time, Johnny Bench. Looking back at Johnny Bench's entire journey in this story, it's hard not to see the tragedy of a whole generation of Americans who poured everything into glory, then quietly paid the price in silence. From the binger boy picking cotton till his hands bled, carrying the sentence, "You have to finish Dad's dream," to the 17-year-old waking after the bus crash with dried blood on his shirt, and the lifelong haunting question, why not me? We see a soul thrown into survival too soon. At just 20, fresh off Rookie of the Year, he returned to a cheap apartment, sat with ice on his knees, lonely amid a nation's cheers. As the heart of the Big Red Machine, 2-time MVP, World Series MVP, he still wrapped 3 layers of ice around his knees, hid stabbing shoulder, back, numb hand pain, so fans wouldn't be disappointed. The 1972 lung surgery, the words "I'll never be myself again," were a brutal cut, showing how glory can hollow a person from within. 4 broken marriages, funerals for parents, siblings, teammates, turned a trophy-filled house into a shelter for a lonely man, but only late in life, winning custody of Justin and Josh, teaching them to catch with trembling hands, sitting in the stands watching them practice. Did Johnny touch what America often forgets in the race for achievement, peace? The image of 77-year-old him walking shakily to his own bronze statue, touching home plate in an empty stadium, crying then still saying, "I'd do it all again, that's baseball, that's me," is one of the most heartbreaking and honorable moments. For the people of the United States, this story reminds that true legacy isn't in the Hall of Fame or MVP count, but in how a person loves family, endures pain, rises after every tragedy even when no crowd claps. It calls us to slow down, cherish health, hug parents and children longer, and understand a life's worth isn't measured by stadium noise, but by kindness and resilience in the quietest nights. If Johnny Bench's journey of tears, grit, and humanity touches you, hit subscribe to join us for the next stories of people who fought to their last breath. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video, where we continue honoring the extraordinary hearts that rise from adversity.